Coming up on the Men at the Movies podcast, we continue our Band of Brothers series with The Last Patrol. Webster was a Toccoa man. He had gone through D-Day with Easy Company, but because he wasn't at Bastogne, he was treated like an outsider. He had to enter into their suffering in order to re-engage with them. And friendship is about jumping into someone else's foxhole, not waiting for them to jump into yours. The deep, meaningful relationships that we have will take work, and we need to fight for the people around us. Join us as we discover God's truth in this story.
The movies and stories we love are gateways to see ourselves and God in new ways.
Every great story borrows its power from a larger story, the story that's written on our hearts and woven into the fabric of our very being. Hello and welcome to the Men at the Movies podcast, Band of Brothers edition. My name is Paul McDonald, and joining me this evening is my friend Andreas. Hey man, how you doing today?
Man, I'm having a great day. It's been a long day at work, but I'm having a great day.
Yeah,
we
get to sit down and spend a couple hours together here.
Yeah, it's a nice way to finish things off.
Yeah. So we are talking about episode 8, The Last Patrol. And as the series has gone on, last week we talked the breaking point, sort of almost like Bastogne Part 2, where they're just in the woods, they're under attack, they're under heavy artillery. One of the quotes that I used last week was every man suffered, men unhit by shrapnel and bullets were nevertheless casualties. So this is sort of part 2 of a mini trilogy within the entire Band of Brothers series, the episode arc, where we're looking at the series as a roadmap of our masculine initiation. And suffering's important. So that's why we're talking about it for at least 3 episodes. As they say, war is hell. And so in this episode, just a little quick synopsis, Webster comes back. And Webster is a private. He was there in Toccoa. He was there in Normandy. He was there when they landed in Holland, but he got injured in Holland. He got wounded in Holland. And he's been gone. And it's now February. So he's missed Bastogne. He's missed all the injuries and all the trauma and all the suffering. And he's showing up with Colin Hanks as Lieutenant Jones, a fresh West Point grad, to Haguenau, France. And they're there in their starched, clean uniforms. And everybody's there is grimy, dirty, looks miserable. The weight of suffering is very evident. And so this whole episode is sort of centered on Webster's experience, try to reintegrate and re-enter a platoon, a unit that he considered his brothers. Like he's going to walk up and sees his old buddies and he's greeting them and they don't even recognize him, some of them. And in episode 1, I talked about there was a conversation between Nixon and Winters. And they were getting ready to go to Normandy. And Nixon's talking about a civilized time for civilized men. And he's talking about, it's happy hour now in Chicago. And wouldn't that be nice to go to a movie or to go to live on what they call a civilized life? I'm actually going to play a clip from the very end of this episode where they're moving out. The Easy Company's leaving Haguenau now. But Webster has some thoughts, and this whole episode's kind of narrated with him as he's going along. And I promise I'll let Andreas talk at some point. We live in the Western world. We want a civilized world. We want civilized times for civilized men. And my contention at the very beginning was that's not possible.
I wondered if people back home would ever know what it cost the soldiers to win this war. In America, things were already beginning to look like peacetime. The standard of living was on the rise. Racetracks and nightclubs were booming. You couldn't get a hotel room in Miami Beach, it was so crowded. How could anyone ever know of the price paid by soldiers in terror, agony, and bloodshed if they'd never been to places like Normandy, Bastogne, or Haguenau?
How could they know the cost back in these civilized worlds if they've never spent any time on the battlefield?
I think it's a hard thing for most people, right? I mean, what he's talking about is the vast majority of America, which the country was at war, but it was only fought by a few. Now, a lot of people had to sacrifice, right? They had to donate money for government bonds, and they had to go work in factories. And America mobilized in a way that's never mobilized before. But when America's fighting its own wars, we're pretty good at it. And so the soldiers who end up on the battlefield, they see and they experience things that it's nothing like movies at home. It's nothing like what's on TV. It's nothing like what's in the propaganda posters. And the story is not really told. And so how then do you explain to people this bond that you have? You know, the men who fought this war, you know, the people talk all the time about how there's a brotherhood that takes place, you know, between men who are in combat together. I think the German colonel actually even speaks about that at the end, right? He's like, you know, it's a bond that takes place, you know, between, you know, men in combat. And I think that has to do a lot with suffering. I think it has a lot to do with how you suffer, who you suffer with, when you suffer. And I think suffering is what builds that. But it's really difficult to talk about suffering to somebody who hasn't gone through it, right? Like there's this whole idea in America where like, hey, here's a cause. We need to build awareness. And what build awareness is really build awareness of the suffering that's taking place, right? Hey, we're going to be suffering because the ozone layer is being depleted. And because dolphins get their noses stuck in the, you know, 6-pack of can, you know, plastic things. And so because the dolphins suffer, we need to make people aware of the suffering. So there's kind of like this element of like awareness that plays into it. And so when it comes to the soldiers, how do you tell that story? And it's really hard. And it's this element of suffering, I believe, right? How do you talk about this element of suffering and brotherhood? And I think it's a really challenging thing. Even people who've been married a long time, right? You've been married 20 years and you say, hey, if your spouse dies, would you want to start over? And people are like, no, absolutely not. Why not? Because there's an element of suffering to being married that no one talks about. Like it's hard, right? Like it's hard to tell that story. Like I don't want to start over with somebody else. Like the amount that I've been through, the amount that I've had to grow, the amount that I've had to trust, the amount that I've had to evolve, that's a lot of work. There's a lot that went into that. I don't want to do that again. Right? Like even Dick Winters talks about that at the very end. He's like, yeah, I was called back into service in 1950. I trained people instead of, you know, going back to war because I was done with that. You know, I'm done with that type of suffering.
Because of what you have suffered, what you and Mandy have gone through in your marriage, the suffering part, it makes some of the victory times even sweeter. And if I've told the story before, I apologize, but somebody asked me at the end of last year, how are you winning? Where are you winning? And that's not a area that I really think of a lot because as I wrote in my journal, all I see is all I haven't done. And so to take a minute and see like, wait, where am I actually ahead? And I was thinking of my daughter, and I'm recording for the first time in a new space, a new studio, because we've rearranged my house. So I'm now basically in a made over closet. But going back, when I go back 5 years ago, where she was fairly estranged, our relationship was not great. Like you can't see the victory. You can't understand the victory without diving into the suffering, without knowing the days that I was praying for her. Am I going to partner with God or am I going to fight him on it? Going back to that idea of initiation, am I going to partner with God in his initiation of me, of my wife, of my kids, even when it takes us to shitty places? Because guess what? It's going to take you to shitty places.
You know, there's a scripture in the Bible where it talks about Jesus getting onto a boat, and the phrase that's used is actually when the storm came. It doesn't say if the storm comes, right? It's when the storm came. And, I feel like that's something that we're guaranteed in life, right? Like we're not in the garden anymore. Things are different. And there's going to be pain. There's going to be suffering. There's going to be hard days. These men, they chose to go to war. They chose to sign up for this unit. Some of them did it because they wanted pride, and some did it because they wanted to be with the best there was, and some did it because it paid an extra $50 a week, right? But they for whatever their own reason was, they chose to be a part of this unit. And while they were trained, they didn't have experience. And so when they showed up to actually fight, there was a learning curve, right? D-Day was a complete cluster, right? It was a challenge. These men had to learn. If you think back to, I think it was episode 3. I think episode 3 is when they get their first replacements.
It's 4 episodes. Yeah.
Is it episode 4? Like you weren't there on D-Day. You don't know what the heck you're doing. Replacements are treated like replacements, whether it's, a week or 2 after D-Day or it's, a year into the war. There's a suffering. There's an element of you're not ready. You haven't actually experienced things. Yeah, you went to boot camp. Yeah, you learned some stuff. But there's a difference between having the skill and the potential and actually like stepping into your strength and your calling and fighting on my behalf.
Again, how can they know the cost if they've never been in the battle?
Yeah, it's so weird. When I come home from outpost and people are like, hey, how was it? I'm always like, good. I hiked. I took a nap. I fished. Still have yet to catch a fish at outpost, but you get the idea.
They didn't call it catching; they call it fishing.
That's right. But there's this element of, how do you talk about it? And when you choose to step into something like that, that's going to activate your heart, it's highly opposed. And you can feel the battle the whole weekend, right? And so, when you come home, and when I come home, it's very much about how do I tell the story of what happened? How do I tell the story of what's going on? Oftentimes I'll come home and the battle's not over yet. Like I still have a lot to process and think about and prioritize and write down and discuss with my wife and take action and like reflect on how I've been doing for the past year. Like the entire time that you're doing it, there's warfare. One of the things I love about John Eldridge's ministry, Wild at Heart, is this concept of a larger story, right? That we're coming in the third act of a much larger conflict that's been going on for time before there was time, right? Like in the beginning was the Trinity and they did their thing. And then at some point the angels were invented or created. And then there was a thing that happened. And then humanity was created later on. Like we show up in the third act. We show up into a world at war. And, frequently we don't really act like it. We act like, oh, well, the battle's been done. She just got this. And in reality, there's a lot more that happens. And I experience that every time I'm up on the mountain. I'd be remiss if I didn't experience it at home too. But, kind of while we're on theme, it's like, yeah, I experience that every single time. I don't think I've been up there a single time where I haven't come home just like a little bit soulfully, emotionally tuckered out.
Yeah.
Is it good? Is it soul filling? 100%. Do I feel refreshed and energized? Yeah. But is there a part of me that feels like I might have got shot in the butt? An easy company tradition? Yeah. I feel like I might have got shot once or twice. So, it's a challenge. Suffering's a crazy thing.
You referenced something that I want to touch on with this other clip. Like apparently we're going backwards through this episode. So they call it the last patrol because when Webster shows up, Easy Company gets tasked with doing a patrol across. They want to take German prisoners, capture some intel, sort of prove that they're doing something along the way. And in the frontline soldiers' minds, this is a pointless task. The war is all but over. Why are we risking lives? And in this instance, they're going to lose a life. Eugene Jackson he doesn't die because a German shot him. He dies because he threw a grenade in and then rushed the room before the grenade actually went off, got wounded, and died as a result of his wounds. Webster is ruminating on this event, and again, this whole idea that like we're seeing in these 3-episode arc of the cost of war, not on a global scale, but for individuals. And so he's talking about Eugene Jackson, and this is what he had to say.
Eugene Jackson was 20 years old. He'd lied about his age when he joined the Army at 16. His family, I'm sure, got a telegram from the War Department saying he died a hero on an important mission that would help win the war. In fact, Eugene lost his life on a stretcher in a dank basement in Hagenau, crying out in agony while his friends looked on helplessly. He was just one more casualty in a war that was supposed to be all but over.
And that's a hard thing. All the things he just said, they're all hard. But specifically, he died in a dank basement in Hagenau while his friends watched helplessly. Like, how do you engage with those who suffer? Because sometimes it feels helpless. Like they were helpless to help Private Jackson. And the other, you had mentioned something, the idea in the Christian world, I think, where you say, Jesus fights my battles for me. Then you go to the other side. Why is there suffering in the world? Especially suffering for people we care about. And I want to go back to that idea of the suffering and the victory as basically two sides of a sword, two sides of a blade, as it were. You have to sharpen both sides of the blade to get a good sharp cut. In our culture, both in the sort of the Western culture, but I even think in the church culture, we are told to minimize our suffering. Because I think it runs counter to the victory of Jesus. I must be sorry. It goes back to Job. I must be suffering because what his friends told him. I must be suffering because of something I did. Because of some uncovered sin. Dude, when I got sick and couldn't go to Uganda last year, I'm laying there, I'm like on the couch for a month. If I had prayed harder, if I had like prepped up more, obviously I didn't really have faith to be healed. Obviously I didn't armor up and pray spiritual protection every day. And that is why I'm sick. This is why I missed the mission. And there's another instance over Christmas. I've talked on here a couple times about my friend Jeremy with pancreatic cancer. And I was hit with this thought. But this idea, like he and his brother were spending what is highly likely their last Christmas together. And the Christmas with his daughters, with his parents. And then I started thinking, well, shit. I have friends, 3 friends who are experiencing their first Christmas without their mother, without their mother-in-law, and without their father. And I'm just sitting on my couch weeping. Because I'm suffering with my friends, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of that quote at the end of Braveheart, right? Where the king, I forget what his name is, the Scottish king. Robert
the Bruce?
Robert the Bruce. Why did that not come to my head? Robert the Bruce is sitting there, and he walks up before the Scottish army, right as they're getting ready to pay homage to the English king. And he walks up and he says, you bled with Wallace, now bleed with me. And I think that's powerful because it hits on shared suffering, right? Suffering is something that you go through with other people. I had 5 funerals this year that I went to. Like, I wasn't expecting that. Like that was surprising. And then, when you end up going through one yourself, you start to realize that suffering is better when like people just show up and hang out and just chill, whether you're talking about the weather or sports or anything. It's nice. I had a brother of mine show up at my house with a bottle of whiskey and just be like, "Hey, how's it going?" And I was like, "Yeah, great. We got supplies." and I mean, that was like really nourishing to my heart. Back in 2018, 2019, something like that. I was having a conversation with Dan Horner. And I went to Dan Horner with the most humble question that I feel like a man could ask, which is like, "Hey, Dan, how do you make friends?" Like, you want to talk about a way to like pull your "do you have what it takes" card away. Like, that's one of the questions that does that, right? And he looked at me and his response is kind of summarized with, "Well, how are you being a friend to men in your life?" And I was like, I want friends to be friends to me, not the other way around. Right? I'm looking for men that will pour into me.
They should jump in my foxhole first. I'm not leaving my foxhole. That's
right?
Crazy talk.
Like, obviously you misunderstood the question, Dan. And his response was dead on. It's, well, how are you currently engaging men and offering your strength, offering your suffering, and being a man in their lives? And that turned me upside down. Right? I was like, oh my gosh, I guess I'm really not. For me, that went back a few years. I lost one of my closest friends in 2015. And, when he passed away, I was so torn about losing more friends that I stopped making friends. And so I didn't. I went through that alone. I had friends that had gone through what I had gone through, but they were 1,000 miles away in a different state. And so here I am. I'm isolated. I'm by myself. I'm self-protecting. I'm coping. And what I learned was to not suffer. What I learned was suffering is bad. I shouldn't do it. This hurts and I'm done. I have already paid the price through the loss of my friend. I think I'm done suffering for a while. And so, it's a frustrating thing to find yourself without friends, near the age of 40. And I came to the realization that I needed to start to suffer for some men. I came to the realization that I needed to start pouring into men. I came to the realization that I had something to offer and that I had a strength, and it was time for me to step into that. And so I started to do that. I started to kind of follow that calling and see where it took me. From the point of view of Webster talking about Jackson dying, right? I mean, if you look at Jackson's character through the episode, he's not really ever illuminated, but he's talked about a bunch. You see him in a bunch of scenes. His name is mentioned. Like, he has like big movements and stuff. Like, from a storytelling standpoint, they make sure that he's not an unfamiliar character by the time that you get to him. And so it's so interesting to me because the way that they demonstrate suffering is through the suffering of his friends that couldn't save him, right? The way that they demonstrate suffering is this guy had no business going on this patrol. None of us did. And he got taken out. Throws a grenade through the window and runs in after him. And it's like, he should have known better, right? We don't know why he did what he did, but it happened. It was senseless. And he got taken out. And I think when that happens, it's like, how do you continue to show love and suffer for a friend that's gone? And that's a really hard thing, is how do you share in someone's suffering? I think Job does a good job talking about it in terms of like, yeah, his friends showed up and they were just chilling, right? They were just hanging out. Same way that my buddy showed up with a bottle of whiskey and just hung out for a night. there was something about just being there. You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to have the wisdom. You don't have to recite anything from a book. You just have to participate in the suffering. And I think that's where Webster, when he shows up, he shows up right after Bastogne. And while he suffered through Normandy and he suffered through Holland, right? He didn't suffer in Bastogne. And that for them, like, that was the most recent suffering. And I think it's a large reason why he's neglected, is because all these other guys got taken out, and he wasn't there to share in any of that. At the very beginning of the episode, he's like, "Hey, where's Muck, and where's Pincala, and where's Toy, and where's Garnier?" And they're like, all those guys got taken out while you were busy doing other stuff in your well, you were in the hospital, and then there was like rehabilitation, and then there was the recruit depot, right? Like, he was doing stuff that he was supposed to do, but other men that really wanted to be a part of that unit, that wanted to share, right? It's said, like, well, Popeye broke out and got back to the line. It's like, yeah, you have a guy who was willing to share in the suffering, and that guy was not you. Like, are you really my brother? Are you really my brother? Are you really willing to share my suffering? Like, nice BDs, they're clean. You need a shower? Probably not, college boy.
Yeah. But it's interesting because you were talking about how you checked out, how you sort of like, I suffered. I don't really want to suffer again. And that's sort of exactly what Webster did. He's like, I don't have to be there. They're telling me to be in the hospital, so I'm going to choose to stay in the hospital, not bust my ass to get back out on the front line, because I know how terrible it is. I might get shot again. I might get killed. And even at one point, they said Webster, he's always trying to get out of stuff. Like, he thought he was better than them. So that schism kind of widened when he reappeared. But in a very similar way, like, it's messy to get in someone else's foxhole. We don't know. The last company there might have shit in the foxhole, and now you're sitting there in a shit foxhole, right? But this idea, like what you were just saying about avoiding making friends, was actually very similar to Webster coming into this. He's like, well, I'm gonna stay behind. I'm gonna stay in the hospital. I'm gonna stay in the rehab place. I got here when they let me. But they're like, yeah, but these guys busted out to get to us. And he spends the rest of the episode trying to make it up to them.
And I think he does by the end, right? Like, by the end of the episode.
By the end, he's helping him into the truck, where before they're just like, who are you?
Yeah, the very first episode, Leafgot's like, whatever. Doesn't reach on a hand to pull him in. Last scene, he's getting pulled in by Leafgot. You're absolutely right. I think it's interesting, right? Because you can have all the talent in the world, but if you're not willing to serve, it's never really given the opportunity to express itself. And so the way that he can offer his strength is by serving the men around him, right? Hey, Leafgot, we don't need two translators. Sit this one out. Thanks, bud. Right?
Yeah.
And he scurries off. But I think the same thing is true for Jones, right? Like, at the very beginning, they're like, Jones, the lieutenant who's fresh out of West Point, who graduated on D-Day and didn't get to the fight till almost a year later. He's having this moment where, hey, can I go on the patrol? No, you're not experienced. Hey, I want to go on the patrol. Denied. Hey, I want to do all these. I want to contribute. I want to help. Too bad you don't know anything. And I don't want to give you responsibility because you'll get somebody killed. And honestly, the last college boy officer that we had was Norman Dyke, and he cost a lot of lives. And we don't want to go down that road again in the breaking point, in Bastogne. And so we're just going to avoid you altogether until we can learn that we can trust you. By the end of the raid, they're retreating away back to their boats after securing the prisoners. And on the way back, he's the last guy. And the sergeant, who was just like, oh, please don't make a mistake and die. Like, I don't want to be responsible for the death of an officer who's just here observing on a mission where we honestly shouldn't even be out. He pitches him the whistle. Well, why'd they do that? Well, they did that because at the very end, when they pitch it to Jones, what they're showing is, hey, we trust you. We trust you to do the right thing. you've earned enough trust in not screwing up, allowing us to do our own thing and allowing us to operate in our strength, that I'm going to go ahead and allow you to go ahead and do this thing that it honestly is the kind of thing that an officer should do, right? So he gets pitched the whistle and he has this moment of just like, oh, the whistle. And then he shoves it in his pocket, right? But it completely changes his posture after that. And for Jones, like, you get to the end of the episode and he's like, hey, it was a pleasure serving with you. Thank you. I wish you luck on the rest of the war, you know? And they're able to have a conversation where they respect him as an officer, kind of as a leader, but really as a man. I think him earning that back showed that it's not limited to just enlisted guys, right? Like, it doesn't matter what rank or title or socioeconomic background that you have, right? It doesn't matter. You're going to have to earn the trust of the people around you.
And we also see, while Vest, who's the other guy who's begged to get on the mission, he's like, I haven't been on a mission. He's the mail guy. He's the guy in the mailroom. It's like, I want to be on a mission. I want to carry a weapon. I want to do something. He's the one, Vest, who spent all this time with them in Bastogne. He's the one who's freaking out. And Jones is the one who's like, you need to get yourself together. You need to chill out. You need to breathe. You know, he's the one coaching him through it. Which makes me think of what you said is like, without the battle, without the suffering, our talents and gifts aren't really seen. What's that quote about sailors? You don't know a good sailor by what they do at the dock, basically. You identify good sailors by how they sail in the storm. And unfortunately, that's true. Like, my brother always says, he's like, I was a great father before I had kids. I knew exactly how I do this, how to interact, how to do all this other stuff. And then you have kids, you're like, that's not working. It's just like West Point. You know, he graduates West Point. We can read all the books we think we need to read on whatever it is we're dealing with. But then once you actually enter into those situations with the people, like, it becomes real. And you're like, oh, this is chaos. This is messy. Like, if we look at all I want is a friend to show up, watch some football with, play golf with, go play pickleball, go fishing, whatever the things that you are. You're like, I just want a friend. I don't want all of that. I don't want the mess. I don't want the foxhole. I don't want the suffering. I just want the chill. Okay, going back to that earlier, I just want a civilized man for civilized times, or whatever.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's an agreement, right? Like, it's an agreement with the enemy. Like, we are not civilized men, and we're not in civilized times. We were born into a world at war.
And this other idea that I get, that I've gotten from therapy years ago, because I had stuff I didn't really want to talk about. I had stuff I didn't want to ever say that had happened to me or that I had done. But one of the things that I discovered is when you numb the pain, you numb the joy. You try to turn off the dark, you also turn off the light. Like, it's like a pendulum. And if you're like, nope, we're not going to go deep into the suffering side, we're going to close that bad boy down. Right? Like you were saying with how you were experiencing pursuing friends, you're like, nope, it's going to be pretty limited because I don't want to suffer. Well, you also aren't going to, pendulums don't swing that high unless they swing both sides. So you didn't probably experience much joy in those days.
No, I didn't. Right. It was really isolated. It was very lonely. I could look around and see other people having friends and having a good time and cutting up. And don't get me wrong. Like, I can BS with anybody. Like, that's not a big deal. But that's more of an act than it is, or a hobby, depending on the scenario, then it is deep and meaningful, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I could show up and tell some jokes and cut up with people and have a good time, but the deep, meaningful relationships that you have are going to take work, and you're going to have to persist. Oh gosh, I was probably 10 years old, and my junior high youth leader, his name was Wayne. Wayne passed away now, but man, Wayne had a huge effect on me, if for no other reason than he said this one quote. I had a birthday, and he was invited to my birthday. And back then, he was the guy, right? He was the guy that I looked up to. The guy was awesome. He was funny. He liked football. He was from Texas, just cool guy, big personality. And I invited him to my birthday party. And it was really more of a birthday dinner than a birthday party, because my parents didn't really do parties. And so I think it was 11th birthday. Anyways, he no-called, no-showed, right? He straight up stood me up. And I was like he was the guest of honor, and he never arrived. And so
For your birthday.
For my birthday. And so you can imagine, this little boy, invites his hero who he sees every week, and he's like, oh yeah, I'll be there. And then he doesn't show up, right? How brokenhearted I was. When I finally talked to him about it, he said, I'm never going to really be your friend until I hurt you, and you still choose to be friends with me. I'm never going to be your friend until I screw up. And you say, in spite of who you are, I still choose you, right? I'm never going to be your friend until I don't show up, until I choose something else over you, until you realize that you're not the most important thing in my life, that you're not the only obligation that I have. I have other things. And you choose to be friends in spite of me, in spite of my preparation, in spite of my prioritization in life. I didn't realize how incredibly deep that was at 11.
Yeah.
In adulthood, I've chewed on that a lot more. And it's one of those kind of core phrases that stuck out to me. It's like, hey, he made a mistake. And for him, it was just a mistake, right? It was like, oh, I didn't pencil it into my calendar. I had a date, whatever it was. And that's why I didn't show up. It was right after church. But it taught me that people are going to make mistakes. They're gonna do things. And that doesn't mean that you never give them another try. You never give them a chance. Because if that's the case, then what you're saying is, you know what? You made a mistake. We're not going to be friends now as a result of that mistake. And that's not Christ-like, right? That's not how Jesus lived. Fool me once, fool me twice, fool me three times, trespass on me once, trespass on me twice, trespass on me three times, nail me to a cross, drag me through town, crucify me out near a dump, right? All of that was hard for Jesus. And he still went through it. He forgave while he was living. He forgave the people around him that didn't realize that they were trespassing on the Son of God. Or maybe they did, right? I don't know. But can you imagine sitting around Jesus? My bad. Right? You would expect of all people, that guy not to be able to sympathize, understand, or forgive. And yet he did. And so, when bringing it back to the episode, you think about, Leapgot. Leapgot forgave. Thanks, buddy. Hey, you know what? You're not so bad. Hey, good luck in the war, men. Yeah, you too. Take care of yourself back at battalion or wherever Jones got transferred to. I forget. But there's this element of, hey, look, it didn't work out the first time, but that doesn't mean that we're not friends. It doesn't mean that we don't have a relationship. It doesn't mean that we're not battle buddies. It doesn't mean that we're not arm in arm, right? Just because Jackson passed away doesn't mean that Easy Company doesn't meet and have a reunion anymore. We still have a relationship. We still have a bond, and we choose that bond over the things that could potentially separate us.
If you have this expectation oh, my friends can never let me down. They have to respond to every text. They have to show up at every meeting. They have to show up at every, we can't miss a game. We can't miss whatever. Well, flip that. Because if that's the expectations you have on your friends, the people that are around you, that's the expectation you have on yourself. And that's a miserable way to live. As someone who knows that is a miserable way to live, there's so much pressure to always respond, always be available, always be present, never screw up. And if you do, you live in fear that, they're going to leave my foxhole now. There's a scene an episode of Scrubs, which is the most authentic medical show that's been made, where the janitor is trying to go out on a date. And they're like, no, you have to be authentic. And then he starts sharing his like stuffed squirrel collection. They're like, no. You can't let her see all your crazy on the first date. You've got to like say 5% of your crazy. You have to expand. And that's actually how it was with my band of brothers. Like, if you do like Jackson and rush in trying to force things, it will blow up in your face. And it's like, oh, well, that didn't work. Well, it wasn't because you're a jerk or any of that. It's like you were like so intense and so focused on everything being perfect and looking the way you think it should that you screwed it up. You didn't let them be people. You didn't let them be them. You wanted them to be who you thought they should be. Where's this guy? Where's this guy? That's not Easy Company anymore, man. Those guys are gone. And even in the suffering, like that idea, like don't rush, like the concept of Jackson died because he rushed into a room after he threw his own grenade. It's like, how, if we're entering into suffering, you go over with a bottle of booze. You don't go in with, well, here's how you need to respond. Here's how you need to fix it. Sometimes it's just saying, hey, man, I'm sorry. That sucks. Can't even imagine what you're going through. All I know is it must be hard.
I think that's one of the reasons why this episode is it's so compelling for brotherhood, right? Because the 7 episodes before this are all the guys depending on each other and leaning on each other. And even in Replacements, there ends up being this beautiful piece.
Right.
And then in episode 8, this episode, these guys show up and they're being shunned by Easy Company. And it's no longer from the third person like it was in the Replacements episode. It's from the first person of men that belonged there, right? Webster. It's like what a masterclass on brotherhood. Like, are you serving with your men? Yeah, things have happened. You haven't been here for me. I haven't been here for you, but I never had the opportunity. I've been serving you this whole time, and you haven't served me at all. I've been out here trying to make sure that most of these guys make it home to their families, or at least survive the war. And you were in rehabilitation and a recruit depot. Like, bleed with me, right? Suffer with me. Yeah. And I feel like when you're making friends, when you're developing brotherhood, when you are going down this path, there's this element of you need to be fighting for the men around you, and not just in a way that's invisible. Like there's an element of brotherhood that's developed because they see you fighting. One of the ways that I do this, and maybe some of the people listening to the podcast have experienced this, but there's guys who will reach out to me, and this happened a few times. They're like, hey, I really need your prayer for this thing. And I'm like, cool. And then every single time that I pray for them, I send them a text message and it says prayed. And after a couple hours, a couple days, however long it's been, like you look at the text message thread and it's like prayed, 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 battle, 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 battle. I'm going to war for you, right? I could write out a big long prayer and pray it once and be good with that. But like for me, that's part of the suffering. That's part of the brotherhood. Is I want you to know when I'm thinking about you. I want you to know when I'm going to war. I want you to see me in the foxhole next to you. I want you to understand that when you asked me to pray, you weren't thinking of an angel that's on top of a tree. You're thinking of angels that are actually geared up for war, right? There's an element of I'm going to think about you. I'm going to think about what you're going through, and it's going to mean something to me along the way.
What you didn't see from Webster is this defensiveness, this need to prove himself or explain himself. Like we could come into this and be like, well, this is why. Like he explained it, and then like, okay, that doesn't matter. Really, the why doesn't matter. The point is you weren't here. You didn't suffer with me. And so he sort of has to let go of that sense, that need to justify himself, and really forgive them, forgive Liebgott in particular, Sergeant Martin. They're both people who are sort of holding him at arm's distance. Again, this is why Band of Brothers is great. This is show, don't tell. I'm sorry I wasn't there. The first time I went to Uganda with my brother in 2016, we were at the end of the clinics. We'd finished. So me and his best friend from medical school and I were sitting there sort of reminiscing, catching up. And my brother has 5 kids. They're all adopted. And they tried to get pregnant before that, and it hadn't happened. And so Jeremy is my brother's friend's name. He shared is like, when we found out we were pregnant, our first thought wasn't like super joy. It was, how are we going to tell Mike and Jess? Like that's that bond, right? He knows how much my brother was suffering. I didn't. This was my literal, actual brother. And like they were sharing stories about this time that I didn't know. And, this was early 2000s. So there was no internet, wasn't great, web, all the things, right? Plenty of excuses. I was at a hospital. I was at a rehab. I had a recruit depot. All these reasons. But I just remember at the end of that night, as we're like, all right, good night. See you guys in the morning. I grabbed my brother and I was like, look, I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. But I promise that will never happen again. And that's the response we see from Webster during this episode. Is he's showing, he's like, hey, I'm sorry I wasn't there for you guys, but I'm going to be there again. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the reason, right? Because we all have reasons. We can't change the past. He's like, hey, this isn't going to happen again. I'm going to be taking your spot so you don't have to suffer anymore. Malarkey suffered enough. Let's get him out of there. Like he's the one who sees his suffering of his friends and does something about it. And he doesn't do it with a pep rally. He doesn't do it. He engages them to give them rest, to give them space. He jumps in their foxhole and suffers with them.
He does. I think he does a really good job of that too, in terms of demonstrating that. One of the things that I picked up around that when I was watching the episode is he hasn't shared battlefield suffering with Lieutenant Jones, but yet he chooses to serve him, right? They're still brothers. They show up and they're like, wow, we are outcasts. Like,
right. They're having the outcast brotherhood.
Right. And so they show up and they're like, oh my gosh, like everyone hates us. No one wants to talk to us. No one has time for us. Everyone just tells us to sit down and shut up and mind our own business. And he chooses to offer his strength to Lieutenant Jones. Hey, Lieutenant, you still want to get your BDs dirty? Yes, I do. How do I do that? Hey, Malarkey's been out a lot. It might be good for you to go, see if you can offer him. And, he goes on to narrate like they had no idea if it would even be possible. But what he demonstrated was, hey, leader, if you want to go lead, here's how you do it on the battlefield. Here's how you do it when we're at war, right? And so he's still able to offer his strength and offer his wisdom to Lieutenant Jones. Now, what's interesting about this is Lieutenant Jones, he wouldn't have been able to get that advice if he hadn't heard it from someone who was also in his situation, right? So there's this element of David Webster had to get wounded. He had to go to the hospital in order for him to be able to offer his strength the way it needed to be offered to Lieutenant Jones, right? He had to heal, right? And I feel like when men are at war, you spend so much time fighting and in combat that it's hard for you to catch your breath and it's hard for you to heal and be like, oh my gosh, I forgot what wholeness is like. I forgot how good things are. And they show that a little bit, right? At the end of the end of episode 3, they're on their way back to England, and they're having a pint and they're having a beer and they're pulled off the front line and they're like, oh wow, I forgot that we could have a moment without stress. And a moment later, Lipton goes up there and says, all right, guys, we're going back to the front lines. Right. And the moment doesn't persist. But I think when you have a moment to get off the line and to pause and to take a breath and to heal and to celebrate victory with the men around you, that allows you to offer your strength again. And I think that's a constructive thing that people need to take time for, right? Like, yeah, you need to be refilled. Your cup might be empty. You might not be able to walk. You might have gotten shot in the ass. It's an easy company tradition. And you need to go heal, right? And then come back. And sometimes you're hurt. Sometimes you're injured. Sometimes you're wounded, right?
Yeah.
But if you're wounded, get the healing that you need and come on back. And what's great about Easy Company is these men who are wounded, who have healed just enough, they come back and they're like, oh, hey, take a load off. Sergeant Lipton's on the couch with pneumonia. And they're like, do you want to go take a nap? He's like, no, I'm good. I need to be useful to the men. I need to suffer for these men. All right, here's a blanket, right? Luz gives him a blanket. And then 2 seconds later, Spears walks in. He's like, what are you doing out here? You got pneumonia. There's fresh sheets on the back. Go take a nap. What are you doing? And Lipton still has this moment of like, I need to suffer. I feel like I can do some good. It's like, you're not really doing that much good. You're just kind of, you're doing some good because you're a voice of reason and the voice of experience that's respected. But honestly, man, you do a lot more good if you just took a moment and healed and actually got over this. I don't know of any soldiers that actively go into battle with pneumonia if they have another option. I'm sure at Bastogne it probably happened to a couple of guys.
Right.
But that's not how you want to fight the battle. It's not how you want to fight the war, right? Take the guys who can fight, that are trained, that have the experience, get them out there and get them trained up, get them fighting wars. The guys who can't fight, all right, you got hit. Let's take you off the line for a second. Let's get you patched up, send you back out when you're ready to go another round. I think there's an element of respite that's needed in battle. And that's never really truly articulated, right? Like, well, you were gone because you wanted to be gone. I mean, Popeye was gone too. Halfway through the episode, they're sitting in the break room while Luz is divvying up rations with Vest.
Chocolates. Yeah.
And who was it? Pencala walks in? No, Picani?
Yeah.
Picani? I forget. Picani walks in. They're like, hey, what are you doing back? I tried to get you out of the war. You got hit in Bastogne. Why are you here? And he's like, I'm here because I'm here. Like, I got enough rest. Am I fully healed? No, I'm not. But I got enough that I can contribute to this fight now. And I think it's important that, just because you're battle capable and battle hardened doesn't mean that you don't need a break, right? There's some times where you need to take a moment and get healed up enough for you to go back into battle. With the loss that I had this year, it was really hard for me to fight on behalf of other men. Like my dad died, and then I was up at Outpost trying to offer my strength.
Didn't go very far, did it?
Guys, I'm going to
I'm swinging as hard as I can, and the ball went 10 feet.
Right. And so, I'm going up there as a trail guide, and I've been in battle. I've been in combat. I know what it's like. I limp back onto the mountain, even though I swore I wouldn't. I'm like, I'm going to be ready for this time. And, I did what I could. I wasn't fully healed. I wasn't fully ready. I tried my best to contribute to the men and breathe into their lives a little bit, but it's hard. Sometimes you do need to take a moment and just heal so that way you can go fight another battle with your full strength.
And like you mentioned with Lipton, it was the men around him who said, hey, you need this. Because the guys in your foxhole will see, it's like, hey, dude, you might need to pump the brakes. I had a meeting the other night and I was just like, can we pause for a minute? Because you seem really frustrated. What's going on here? And he's like, kind of vents about all the stuff he's frustrated about that really have nothing to do with the meeting. And it's like, okay, sometimes that's all it is just to see somebody and be willing to enter into a mess and ask a weird question of, like, people know if I say, how are you doing? I actually want to know how you're doing. I'm like, and I told my son who's at school, it's like, hey, when I check in, I'm saying how you're doing. What I'm really saying is, how's your heart? Are you okay? And he gets it. So he's like, okay. And so he's able to handle it. But as we close and go to an action item or side of action steps, this idea, like, who do you need to forgive? Friends who have disappointed you, who may have hurt you. And I'm not saying like the friendship has to be restored to the full intimacy that it was, because sometimes that's not possible. But sometimes you can let go of resentment that holds you back from other friendships. Who do you need to suffer with? Who needs your specific gifts and talents in their foxhole to help them, whether it's showing up with a bottle of bourbon or texting them that they prayed, or just praying for them and their needs and just being willing to, hey, let me get you a cup of coffee. What's really going on with you? And realize, like I said, I spent that morning around Christmas on my couch crying for my friends who are hurting. Like, I'm glad nobody was around. The family was all in other parts of the house as I'm there, but there's a sense like I'm embarrassed or don't want to share or show people that. And there's even a sense like some of this stuff is like this idea like, oh, this was really sad. This is really hard. And this idea like grief doesn't need to be healed. It needs to be comforted. Tears are okay. A mess is okay. Not all tears are sad. Some are, but that doesn't mean they're bad. Like, it means that you're processing stuff, that you care. And again, if you allow yourself, you open up that level of your heart, you're going to open up the laughter side as well. And people know I am a big laugher.
I want to share one last thing before we close, if that's cool. About 4 years into my marriage, I was sitting on the couch, and I was sitting with my wife. On the couches. The couches, it was a very small room, so there was a couch on each side. and so we're
facing
sitting in
each
there,
other.
and
it's like you're in a bus.
It was tiny. It was a tiny house. So we're sitting in there, and we're having this conversation, and out of the blue, she says one of the most transformative statements, profound things that I've heard. And it really makes me consider like how I treat people. She says to me, I was so upset the day that I realized you're not the man that I thought you were supposed to be. Right? And like
the rest of that could have gone really poorly.
What do you mean I'm not the man that you thought that I was? Like, what? And what she was saying is that she had these expectations in her head, right? Like, I am doing everything that I'm supposed to be doing. I don't know why you're not doing what I think that you're supposed to be doing. I've checked all the boxes in my head. Why aren't you checking all the boxes in my head? And so I think when it comes to brotherhood, there is this element, and friendship, there's this element of letting go and saying, it's okay. It's okay that you don't check every box. It's okay that you don't prioritize me and everything that I go through. It's okay. It's okay that we don't talk every day. It's okay that we don't text every day. It's okay that, we don't check in once a week. Maybe it's once a month. Maybe it's once a quarter. Maybe it's once a year. I don't know. Maybe it's once every few years. But I feel like a brother is a brother when you can go to battle with him, but he's free to go fight his own wars. And, the reality is, after the war was over, all of these men went back home and they fought their own battles in their own ways. The very end of episode 10 talks about that, right? Dick Winters is narrating it. And eventually they got back together and they had reunions and they saw each other after the war. But all these men, they had to go out on their own after experiencing brotherhood and fight by themselves. Shifty, in that last episode, he says, during the war, I felt like I could do anything, like anything was possible. And then I went home and I lost a lot of that. He says it in his country bumpkin kind of voice, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, there's going to be times where you're going to have friends that are going to trespass you, friends that are going to do things inadvertently, and things aren't going to go the way that it was before. And when you can offer grace to your friends, that is such a powerful thing. And just like you said a moment ago, whether you show up at my house with a bottle of whiskey or something else, right? Like, grace is giving somebody something that they don't deserve. And when you're able to offer your strength, when you're able to offer your friendship, even for a season, and still have an open hand to let them go, like, that's really, for me, what it's about, because they're going to be called to their own kingdom. They're going to be called to their own path. They're going to be called to their own battle. That's going to have different people and different players that they're going to have to lead and fight and win. And hopefully the time that they've spent with you is enough for them to fight those battles and also come out on top. And so I just want to double down that, expectations are good for yourself, but, comparison is really the thief of joy. When you're trying to go through relationships and think about, well, this friend treated me this way and this friend treated me this way. Why aren't you doing the same? Well, you're not the person I thought that you were supposed to be. And I'm okay with that. And I love you.
Good stuff. So, Andy, thanks for showing up and wrestling through this content with me this evening. I enjoyed our conversation.
Me too.
So this has been Paul McDonald and Andreas Werner talking about Band of Brothers, The Last Patrol. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and hope you join us next time here on the Men at the Movies podcast.
Something inside has been awakened. I can no longer be who I was before. But if I am no longer who I was, who am I to be?